Greetings, friends, and welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. Maimonides, otherwise known as the Rambam, is widely considered one of the greatest Jewish minds of all time. Over a long and productive career, Maimonides produced a number of scintillating works, which have guaranteed his place at the heart of the Jewish canon. His two most important works reflect two major facets of Maimonides' intellectual persona. His Mishnah Torah, one of the foundational works of Jewish law, reveals Maimonides as one of the great halachists, or Jewish legal authorities, of all time. On the other hand, his famous philosophical treatise, The Guide for the Perplexed, reveals Maimonides as one of the great Jewish philosophical minds of all time. As scholars have noted for centuries, there are many tensions and many discrepancies between Maimonides the philosopher and Maimonides the halachist, or the rabbi, which brings up the fascinating question of who is the real Rambam and what were his true opinions. This explosive question lies at the heart of all those who study Maimonides in depth, and we are fortunate today to be joined by a fellow admirer and scholar of Maimonides, Professor Noah Feldman, the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, Chairman of Harvard Society of Fellows, and a founding director of the Julis-Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli law. Aside from publishing many popular and scholarly works and lecturing extensively within American law, Professor Feldman also leads a seminar at Harvard Law School in Advanced Jewish Law and Thought, a seminar that I personally attended for 8 semesters, which should give you some idea of my opinion of it. And it is within the confines of this particular seminar that we spent many hours poring over Maimonides and his works. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome back my old teacher to the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Professor, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you, JJ. I'm really honored to be here. The only condition of my participation is you have to call me Noah. Or you can call me Noah if you insist, but either one, but not Professor. I
see. Okay, so I shall have to restrain my natural British proclivity towards titles and hierarchies. Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, so let's jump into our topic for today, a topic that I know we both share a great passion and interest in, which is Maimonides. And I want to start with the basic question of why Maimonides? In other words, it's been 8 centuries since he passed away, and he's been one of many, many great Jewish scholars over the centuries, and yet we all return to him. Maimonides is extensively studied, extensively focused upon, and why him? What was specifically remarkable about him? Why is he so special? Why do scholars across the religious and academic spectrum still obsess over the writings of this one man?
I think there are 3 reasons, each corresponding to a different facet of Maimonides or the Rambam's extraordinary productivity. The first has to do with his role in the history of halakha, of Jewish law. And there, Maimonides stood for the idea that was not always the dominant idea in Jewish legal thought, that Jewish law can and should be codified. That is, drawing upon the Bible, drawing upon the Talmud and the huge body of rabbinic interpretation that goes alongside the Talmud, always leaves the possibility that the right way to engage with Torah is by studying the discussions, the arguments, and the debates. And then it also leaves room for the possibility that someone should take all of this enormous corpus of material, which is distributed, let us say, haphazardly, at least in the case of the Talmud, and in the case of the Bible, it's distributed in a way that to an ordinary human looks haphazard, even if there might be a divine plan behind it, and to bring it all into a code meaning a set of rules that's organized logically, that begins at the beginning and ends at the end. And the Rambam set out to do that. And while he may or may not have been the first person in Jewish history to do so, there's some historical debate about that, he was certainly the first person to do so with the extraordinary skill and power that he did. And that point of view ended up becoming hugely important for subsequent Jewish life, primarily, I would say, for us today, because the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, following Maimonides' impulse, although not his organizational plan, and often citing Maimonides' words, produced his own code of Jewish law that, for very complicated reasons having a lot to do with the history of printing and where people lived and who lived where, became the basis for what we think of as today's traditionalist Judaism. And by traditionalist, I just mean anyone in the Jewish world who would agree to the sentence, I am bound by the law as a matter of my obligation to God. And so the first reason that we still talk about Maimonides today is that he was the first person to do this, and his specific codification was so influential, more than any other single work, on the book that more than any other created the space of contemporary traditionalist Judaism. So that's point one. I think reason two has to do with Maimonides' philosophical interests and his interest in trying to do something that people today, at least some people today, care a lot about, namely reconcile what was already in his day an ancient religious tradition with the best of what smart people, whether Jewish or not, thought was scientifically and philosophically true in their era. And it would be fair to say that in the Rambam's philosophical writings, this is a preoccupation. And what's more, that the Rambam thought it was possible in some way, and we'll talk more about this, to reconcile the truths of the Torah with the truths of science and philosophy. And that is an undertaking that is always going to be exciting and engaging and interesting to anyone who both wants to believe in the Torah in a traditionalist way and also wants to be connected to the world of science and the world of philosophy. So that's an undertaking that continues to resonate and has been resonating strongly for Jews since, I would say, the birth of modernity, since the time of what we think of as modern science and philosophy. So that's the second reason. And the last reason is a bit quirkier, but I think it has to do with the rise of the modern Hebrew language. And this is a point that the late professor and rabbi Isidore Twersky, Zatzal, very much liked to emphasize in his own writing and speaking about Maimonides. And that is that Maimonides was an incredible innovator in the use of the Hebrew language. He wrote the Code of Jewish Law entirely in a Hebrew that is not just derivative of classical rabbinic Hebrew. There were plenty of things that Maimonides changed from classical rabbinic Hebrew, plenty of ways that he tried to sharpen the grammar and formalize the logic. And he wasn't alone in trying to revive Hebrew language in his era. There were lots of people who lived in medieval Islamic Spain, Andalusia, who were Jews who tried to do something similar. And many of those were great poets, which is the one thing that Maimonides is not famous for. He did write a couple of short poems, but he's not primarily famous as a poet. But they did care about the language, but they produced poetic language, which is not that accessible. He tried to produce a Hebrew that anyone who could understand basic biblical Hebrew would be able to read. And that task looks especially remarkable in an era where the revival of the Hebrew language in the modern state of Israel seems like one of the great accomplishments of contemporary or Jewish life of the last 100 plus years, because he did a version of that himself. And I think that's yet another reason why he seems up to date and relevant to us.
Do you think this was something that was sort of explicit in his mind, that refining, sharpening, simplifying the Hebrew language was something he knew that he was doing, that something that was forefront in his mind, or was this something he did as a byproduct of his legal work?
Yes, he knew he was doing it for sure, because he had to invent words, grammatical formulations. Often you'll see him take a Talmudic passage, which he's restating for you, and restate it in a way that clearly shows that he's trying to restate it in a way that you, the reader, will be able to follow, that is simpler and cleaner than the way that the Talmud framed it. So for sure, 100%, he knew that what he was doing. Was it central to him? I think it was central to him because he believed that the goal of his code was to produce a book that any Jew could read and know what that Jew should believe and what that Jew should do. And that meant accessibility was crucial to his project. And of course, accessibility is one of the reasons to have a code at all. A code is by definition more accessible than trying to read a page of the Talmud. So I think language is important to a code. If you're going to have a code and the code is going to work, it has to be in a language that people can understand, or it won't do the job it's supposed to do. So in that sense, it may have been for Maimonides a byproduct of that objective, the objective of getting people to learn the Torah in an accessible way, that he made the language so much clearer. I don't think he thought that the language had a value inherently. And a proof of that is when he went to write his philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed, he wrote that in Arabic. That was not a book that was intended for every Jew everywhere forever to be able to understand. And so it wasn't necessary for him to write that in Hebrew. And so he didn't.
Interesting. So you mentioned Maimonides' great philosophical work, and I'm going to take advantage here of your expertise in Arabic philosophy, which is sort of another part of your scholarly career before you became professor of law. And I just want to ask you, what would you say to, let's say, a student who wants to pick up the Guide for the Perplexed nowadays? What are the major ideas or points of interest that Maimonides would have been grappling with, and that were alive and kicking within the Islamic philosophical world of his time, which he addresses in the Guide for the Perplexed? In other words, what pre-information do you need before opening up that book?
It's a great question, and you do need pre-information, because even though the guide has a long introduction and then a long set of definitions, they're introductions and definitions for a reader who already is supposed to know a certain number of things and have a certain set of preoccupations. So the first thing at the highest level of generality is that philosophers who came from the Islamic tradition brought together the great Greek philosophical works that they knew of, which means, to a first approximation, the works of Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle interpreted through the lens of interpreters who lived quite a bit after Aristotle himself did, who were sometimes called Neoplatonists. They had ideas that were derived from Plato, but they brought them to bear on their interpretation of Aristotle. That's a little complicated, but it's relevant to know it. And so Islamic philosophers were trying to reconcile those philosophical teachings with the teachings of Scripture. In their case, the Scripture of Islam, of the Quran. And they were also trying to reconcile it with a set of religious ideas that they believed could be found in their holy book, that in some sense are analogous to ideas that Jews are accustomed to thinking of as to be found in the Bible, even though if you read the Bible literally, you won't find them there. Most famously, and this was a central preoccupation for Islamic thought, and it is a very important question in the guide, arguably one of the two most important questions in the guide, the question of whether the world was created from scratch, which is my translation of the Latin ex nihilo, out of nothing, or in Hebrew yesh me'ayin, something from nothing.
A very sharp technical translation, you might say.
You might say, trying for it to be,
Right.
or whether God created the world out of some pre-existing matter. And then closely associated with that is the question of whether there will be an end to things, whether things will cease to exist, whether the matter that was created is subject to what is called corruption, that is to say, passing out of existence, or whether it will always exist in some form. So that was a question that felt to Islamic philosophers and also felt to Maimonides like an issue on which they thought there might be some tension or even contradiction between Greek philosophical thought and what they thought was the teaching of Scripture. And I say that just in passing because, if you were just to read Genesis and see that in the beginning of God's creating of the heaven and the earth was null and void, or chaos and void, tohu vavohu.
Welter and waste, Alta has it. Welter and waste. Yes.
Good. I like that. That's good. Alter's an amazing translator. And the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. So you could read that text. If you were just reading the literal meaning of the text, you might read it not to think that Genesis is telling you that there was nothing at all and God created something. But by the middle of the Middle Ages, Muslims and Jews were pretty sure that their traditions did teach some kind of creation from nothing. And so they were worried about the fact that the Greek philosophers, as far as they could tell, thought that there had always been something, some form of matter, and that it had come into the form in which it subsequently came at a moment in time, and therefore was not subject to what the philosophers called generation and corruption. Generation meaning being brought into existence, and corruption meaning going out of existence. So that's one preoccupation, and it's a preoccupation that Maimonides shared with Islamic philosophers of his day. It's connected to, I would say, the second most important preoccupation, which is the question of what prophecy is. And here the question is simply this. If God is omnipotent, omniscient, and infinite, how or in what way can that God's communications make their way to we humans who, if we're anything, we're finite, we're limited in our capacities, we're limited in our powers? And so somehow prophecy is supposed to be about the transmission or the translation of something from the divine realm into something in the human realm. And that's a core problem if you're philosophically inclined, and Islamic philosophers were super interested in this question of what was the nature of prophecy. And so is Maimonides, and that's also connected to the nature of what is the truth and how can we know the truth. And I would say that connects up to what you might call the question of reason against revelation. And this is less I guess you could call this, it's related to the other two things. You could call this the third great theme of Islamic philosophy that's also a great theme of the guide. And you could put it this way. Revelation is that which God has conveyed by prophecy to humans. And it must be true because God is truth. And certainly God could never communicate anything that would not be true. Reason is the mechanism vouchsafed to humans for understanding the world around them. And philosophers believed then, and many believe now, that it's possible to use reason to ascertain or apprehend some deep and fundamental truths about the way things are. And so if reason entails truth and revelation entails truth, they should match. But if you read the Bible or the Quran, the one thing it doesn't sound like, neither sounds like a book of philosophy. They definitely don't sound like a book of Aristotelian or Platonist philosophy. And so I would say the third grand theme is, what is the relationship between reason and revelation, assuming they ought to match? Because truth should be truth. Ideally, we don't want to say that there are two kinds of truth, although we might, find ourselves forced into something like that position. And then I would say the other big problems of the guide all derive from those are the big three, the three grand questions. And you could, name concrete topics that fall in there. Like, for example, what can we say about God? What do we know about God? How can our human language describe God? That's a core problem for Maimonides, and it's a derivative of the three big problems that I'm describing.
Right. Okay, thank you. That was sort of a slightly side question, but that was something that I was very interested in having your opinion on. So I want to dive into the main question that I posed in my introduction today, which is the relationship between the Maimonides of the Guide for the Perplexed and Maimonides of the Mishneh Torah. I mean, to get into this, I want to ask you, do you discern within these two major works of Maimonides discrete and different personalities? Are there, so to speak, two different Maimonidean style authors within this? And are they, to what extent do you believe them to be different? To what extent are they in tension with each other? And to what extent can we speak of a unified Maimonides behind both of these very different books?
I want to start, JJ, I love this question, by pushing back just a tiny bit against the formulation of personalities.
Okay.
Just because, when you're speaking to your class and you're speaking to your kids, you are speaking in two different ways, for sure. I hope so. My kids might complain that sometimes I spoke to them too much, like I was speaking to a class, but you still have one personality, ideally. Those are just different modes of expression appropriate to the situation. On the other hand, when you read a book, and it doesn't matter whether it's a novel or, a serious tome or whatever you like, sometimes you get a feeling, often you get a feeling that there's a kind of authorial voice, that the author is speaking to you in a certain way, from a certain perspective, even if the author never uses the word I at all, or the word we. And Maimonides does like to use the word we, although he's not crazy about the word I. So then you might have a kind of, you might call it a persona, but even that I think is too strong. We're really talking about a voice. And that can vary across the same author in different books. And it usually does. So I want to first say that the answer is yes. There are definitely different authorial voices in the guide and in the Mishneh Torah, the code, for sure. Most of that flows from the fact that they have different purposes. And they're aimed at different audiences. As I mentioned, the purpose of the code of Jewish law, of the Mishneh Torah, according to Maimonides, is to write a book that any Jew who could read could understand and know what they should believe and what they should do. It's a very ambitious goal, but it's a goal, specific kind of goal. Ambitious and yet specific. In the introductory letter to the guide, Maimonides tells his student, to whom he's nominally addressing it, that this is a book for someone like you, and that someone like you is someone who is a committed Jew, takes tradition seriously and wants to follow God's law, and who simultaneously has become pretty deeply versed in contemporary philosophy. And here's the punchline, is perplexed about it. Right? That's why the book is called The Guide of the Perplexed, or The Guide for the Perplexed. It's the same thing in Hebrew and Arabic. The x of y could also be the x for y. So some people say guide of, some people say guide for. Neither is really right or wrong. And so that's a very specific kind of person who has a set of issues and concerns that are basically intellectual, philosophical. And among other things, Maimonides doesn't seem very worried in the guide that his reader will decide to walk away from Jewish practice. He doesn't seem very worried about that. I think because he thinks that a really sophisticated philosopher will accept his philosophical arguments for why Jewish practice, Jewish legal practice, is so important. And so he can say things there that might seem too risky to say in a different genre, which is aimed at more people. And he assumes a tremendous degree of knowledge of detailed and complex questions that he doesn't assume in the code. So to the extent that he sounds different, and he does sound different in the two works, a lot of it has to do, I think, with the intended audience. I'll add one third thing. The guide, and we'll talk more about this, I hope. The guide is a book obsessed with the idea of contradictions. Maimonides spends a long time in the introduction to the book telling you about all the different kinds of contradictions that can exist in a book. And this has been very tantalizing to lots of readers who try to figure out what it means that a book tells you about a lot of contradictions, and then the book might include some things that look like contradictions. So that's that's the invitation that many people have experienced to read the guide as a kind of puzzle in which there are hidden or encoded or secret messages, and we can talk about that. But it's also true that the Mishnah Torah does not talk about contradictions that much, and ideally wants to present itself as a coherent system with no contradictions, because that's what a code is. A code is not a section where you tell the law on one topic and then you find some other place that the law is the opposite. That's not what a code is supposed to be. If there's an apparent contradiction, the code should explain it and should tell you why they in fact are all reconciled and fit together. And the goal of the guide is not necessarily to solve every one of the problems that it poses. And in the guide, Maimonides doesn't try to solve all of the puzzles. And that's another thing I hope we can return to. That is to say, Maimonides' own account of how far reason can get you and what the limits on reason are.
I would like to also ask about specifically differences, let's say intellectual differences or differences in intellectual posture. In other words, does it make a big difference when writing as a philosopher and as a halachist when approaching certain specific issues? Are there issues addressed which he simply takes a different view or takes a different opinion on? And when that's the case, I mean, this is sort of a very old question, especially in the religious world of, do you believe the Maimonides of the Mishnah Torah or do you believe the Maimonides of the Guide for the Perplexed? And is this really a live question? And, how does one begin to approach this, let's say, intellectually, honestly?
For me, it is a live question. It's a question, at least, that fascinates me and continues to fascinate me. Although I have my own kind of take on it that's evolved over the course of my own life, which partly entails the view that the question is the wrong question. But before I say that, let me talk about why I think it is a live question, and it's certainly one for me. One way that we study Torah traditionally, one way, not the only way, is we try to put ourselves in the mind of a particular thinker whom we think of as particularly brilliant, and we try to reconstruct what that thinker's beliefs and views are or ought to have been. And that entails a lot of considering of possible contradictions and reconciling them. And not for nothing, but the method of rabbinic Talmudic study that is tremendously popular today, not the exclusive, but one of the most popular, which is often called the Brisker Derech, or the Brisker way of studying Talmud and rabbinic materials, it has its origins in a very slim book of tremendous genius by Rabbi Chaim Halevi of Brisk, who lived in the 18th century, which is his novellae, his chidushim, on Maimonides and on the Mishnah Torah, in which he goes into the Mishnah Torah, and you could sort of say he does for the Mishnah Torah what the Tosafists sometimes try to do for the Talmud. That is, he tries to find things that look like they contradict each other and resolve the contradictions. But what made him a genius was not just that he used some version of that method. After all, the Tosafists, the Balei HaTosfot, did use that method. It's that he solves these problems by what we would call conceptual analysis. Namely, he tells you that when something appears to contradict itself in the same terminology, there are really two concepts at work or two sub-concepts at work. And if you understand that one concept is operative in one context and the other concept is operating in the other context, you'll see that what sounds like a contradiction can actually be reconciled. And he was a genius at this. And that's why a whole method developed by him and by his descendants came to be named for them, for the family. And so the reason this is relevant is that that's how many people, especially in the yeshiva world, study Maimonides. That's how they study his legal work. So once you're already in the game, and I mean game in the positive sense, not the pejorative sense, once you're already in the game of trying to get inside the mind of Maimonides and assume, as you have to assume for that method, that it all magically fits together, then it's pretty hard if you've been trained by that and then you come across the guide for the perplexed not to keep doing the same game. Right? You still want it all to fit together. I mean, if your whole Talmudic study is based on the idea that Maimonides is this genius where it all works together, it's not going to be very satisfying to say, oh, but this whole other book, we just leave that book out of it. So I think that's one of the reasons that we remain kind of fixated on trying to read Maimonides in this way and to try to reconcile it, because there are tensions. Without any question, there are tensions. They're not always direct contradictions. Sometimes they're implied contradictions, but there are things that seem genuinely different between the two works. So for me, that's why it's a live question. It's live so long as there are people, readers, who want Maimonides to be consistent. And if you want Maimonides to be consistent, it's not just that you want the abstract idea to be consistent. You want the man who lived to have been consistent. And to the extent we're humanly able, we want to try to reconstruct what he thought about things. And that drives us in the direction of consistency. So that's why I think the question is live.
So why have you moved away from the question, as you said earlier?
Well, okay, so here's why. The classic approaches to this usually try to say something like the following. Either they say, Maimonides was completely consistent, and if in the guide he sounds like he's saying something more radical theologically than he says in the code, it must be just because of emphasis. And in fact, the philosophical problem that he poses in the guide, he answers in some way in the code, or some people would say he just answers at a different level of generality. Or the more radical reading of Maimonides typically would say that in the guide, which is written for a small number of scholars, he's telling you what he quote unquote really thinks. And in the code, he's telling you what you should think. He's telling you, don't worry your pretty little head about issue X or issue Y. And so the implication goes, that must not be what he really thought. Now, here's why I've kind of subtly moved away from the question of, can we answer what he really thought? Maimonides himself believed and said, in both the code and even in the guide, albeit indirectly in the guide, that different human beings are capable of different levels of intellectual accomplishment. And given that observation, which was broadly shared with other Islamic philosophers who thought the same kind of thing, and it goes roughly back to Aristotle, the appearance that one formulation contradicts that of another might just be the level of complexity at which it's capable of being understood. And so it could be that in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides is not saying something he doesn't believe. He's not saying you should believe something that he doesn't think is true. He's saying this is the appropriate degree of complexity for you to understand if you're reading this. And if you're going to go deeper, that's cool, but this isn't the place for that to happen. And if that's the case, then the whole question of are there two Maimonides or one Maimonides? Is the point reconcilable? It sort of misses the point. It's that Maimonides himself knows that in writing for multiple audiences, you have to reach those different audiences in different ways. And the statements you're saying might seem contradictory, but that's just because you haven't gone deeply enough into their underlying meaning. That is to say, what he says in the code is never not true. It just might not be true if seen in a certain lens. And similarly, what he says in the guide is also not false in any way. It's just true when seen through a different kind of lens. And I would say, I think some of what I'm saying, I don't want to attribute it to him literally, only because I don't want to misrepresent his views. But I think what I'm saying is very much under the influence of two people, of Professor Twersky, whom I mentioned earlier, who was an extraordinary scholar of Maimonides and my teacher, and one of his greatest students, Professor Bernard Septimus, Beryl Septimus, may he be separated for long life, who is still alive and well and writing about Maimonides, who is even less direct in what he thinks about these things than Professor Tversky, but I am offering my interpretation of a method of reading Maimonides that I learned from the two of them now more than 30 years ago, and that I've tried to keep up since. And I think when I was a kid, it was hard to fully understand this. And when you get older and you understand the complexities of different life situations, it starts to make more sense that there are different stages and levels of comprehending the same truth.
So this is fascinating, your representation of this, especially because you came at it seemingly, at least from the philosophical side. And what I mean by that is, if you ask philosophers, they'll typically say, listen, the Moreh Nevuchim is the Rambam's real, deep opinions. However, the Mishneh Torah is simply what he wrote for the masses and was him playing, so to speak, at being the rabbi. Whereas, of course, if you walk into many yeshivot and many sort of more traditional spaces of learning nowadays, you'll find the precise opposite approach, which is that the Mishneh Torah was Maimonides' true exposition, and Moreh Nevuchim was simply something he wrote in order to satisfy those who are philosophically minded, but really those were compromises he was making, which he maybe didn't himself believe in, or he was simply saying it in order to satisfy the perplexed, which he wasn't.
And I'm saying that those are both too simple. I hate to say that they're wrong, but I think they're both too simple. They're both failing to understand the possible complexity in a thinker, and especially a thinker whom both sides agree is one of the greatest thinkers in 2,000 years of Jewish history. So if anyone deserves a charitable set of expectations or interpretations, surely it's he.
Okay, fine. So I want to say a couple of things to that. I mean, firstly, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you would probably agree to the assertion that Maimonides doesn't really have, let's say, a magnum opus in that sense, or there's not one book which you could point to.
No, I wouldn't put it that way. I would not put it that way. So I would say, and this is very much following Professor Tversky, but I'm completely convinced that it's true. The Mishneh Torah, the Code of Jewish Law, is unquestionably Maimonides' magnum opus. I mean, it's 14 volumes. It purports to and does cover the entirety of what was then already 1,000 years of halakhic tradition. It's still being read and evaluated line by line today, nearly 1,000 years later. How many books in the history of humanity can you say that about? Incredibly few. So that's a magnum opus, and he intended it to be a magnum opus.
Right.
The guide is something different. The guide is a masterpiece, but a masterpiece is different than a magnum opus. It's a masterpiece aimed at a particular function or a particular purpose, and that achieves that purpose to the highest degree that it can be done. And the guide is that. It is absolutely a masterpiece. But I think if we had Maimonides here and said, which is more important, not for a moment do I imagine that he would say that the guide is more important. But the guide takes on a set of questions that are not necessarily fundamental to everyday Jewish religious life, though they are once you're perplexed. Once you're the person who's perplexed, you can step aside and move to the other. And I will just append to this point a metaphor that Maimonides himself uses in the Code when he's talking about when you can study complex philosophical questions. And he uses the metaphor of a meal. And he says, a man should not drink wine until he has filled his belly with bread and meat. And then he says, and he's paraphrasing the Talmud here, and what is bread and meat? Those are the teachings and distinctions of Abaye and Rava. That's the Talmud. And once you've done that, then you can get to the wine. And the wine is the question of metaphysics and its relationship to physics, and the question of the relationship between scripture and reason. And so, he's not downplaying, I don't think, the importance of the wine, but he's also telling you that it's not the thing that fills you up. And he's also hinting brilliantly at the same time that if you drink the wine before you have the meal, you're going to get drunk very quickly.
Maimonides does not have a magnum opus, but would it still be fair to say that neither work or not entirely, but neither work exemplifies Maimonides much better to a much greater degree than the other? Or you think that no, the Mishneh Torah? Okay, let me back up the question for a moment, because you're teaching obviously at Harvard, and Harvard has the legacy of two massive scholars of medieval philosophy, medieval Jewish philosophy, who took precisely opposite views on this question. So one was in the mid to late 20th century was Harry Ostrom Wolfson, for whom, so far as I can tell, in his writings treats Maimonides primarily as a player within medieval philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
That was his bread and meat. In other words, that was his primary pursuit. And the other, of course, was his student, as you mentioned, Professor Tversky, who we'll speak more about shortly, who took the other position that seemed that the Mishneh Torah was, and that being part of the rabbinic tradition was in fact Maimonides' main pursuit, even if he was obviously principal among the philosophers as well. And so, where would
you could actually add a third position to that, not one that was held at Harvard particularly, but the historian of political philosophy and sometime philosopher Leo Strauss took the view that Maimonides engaged with hard philosophical questions, but was not, in Strauss's definition, quote, a true philosopher, because in Strauss's definition, to be a true philosopher, you had to line up with the philosophers on the big questions like the eternity of the world. And in his view, when push came to shove, Maimonides did not align with those positions. And that made Maimonides not a philosopher, not in the sense that you and I would say that a person who deals with philosophical questions is a philosopher, but in the almost quasi-religious sense that, according to Strauss, the ancients thought of philosophers, namely the people, the cult of people who loved wisdom and therefore held certain philosophical views. So you could add that view in as well, which is sort of, in a way, it's different than either of the other two views. So, I mean, looking at this set of views, I guess I would say they're all onto something. The late and very great Professor Wolfson, whom I'm sad to say I never knew, the chronology just wasn't right for me. He was right to see that Maimonides was deeply interested, especially in the Guide, in some of the grand questions of the philosophical tradition. And what's more, that subsequent interpreters of Maimonides who wrote about him engaged that way too. And that was the subject of Wolfson's famous book, famous among a few people, maybe not world famous, but an important book at the time, called Crescas's Critique of Aristotle, which is actually about the Spanish Jewish thinker Crescas's Critique of Maimonides. It just would have been bad politics at the time to call the book Crescas's Critique of Maimonides. It was about, Wolfson's job in his lifetime was to show the general Western Academy that there were Jewish philosophers who had dealt with the central questions of Western philosophy. That was his purpose. He was creating modern Jewish studies. He was creating the field of Jewish studies in America by that mechanism. And so that's why he wanted to focus on that point. And he's right about that.
And he succeeded.
He succeeded at least. He succeeded at least in his day. Whether medieval Jewish philosophy will survive as a field in the American Academy is very much in question now. I pray and hope that it will. But he did succeed for at least a century, which is a pretty good accomplishment. Then Professor Tversky was right to say, and he was a student of Wolfson's, was right also to say that throughout his own work, Maimonides emphasizes the Mishneh Torah and is deeply committed to the authority of the rabbinic tradition and to the authority of law. That's true. That's unquestionably true. The hardest one is Strauss. What did Maimonides actually think about some of the hardest questions? That's actually really hard to say definitively, because Maimonides, and this is the thing you just have to admit it, in the Guide, on some of the hardest questions, he doesn't quite tell you what he thinks. He comes close to telling you what he thinks. He suggests what he thinks, but he doesn't quite deliver the entirety of what he thinks, I think it's fair to say. And so for that reason, it's not clear that Strauss is correct about what the content of Maimonides' ultimate views were.
So I agree with you. And in fact, Len Goodman, who we had on here a bunch of weeks ago, also very much followed your opinion.
Great scholar, yeah.
Yes, we're all very much looking forward to his translation of the Guide next year. But I want to press a little bit further on Strauss, because I agree with you on Strauss's opinion about the content of Maimonides. But what about his general orientation that, as you mentioned before, of the Guide being a kind of a puzzle? And I actually want to extend the question onto the Mishneh Torah as well, because I also taught the Mishneh Torah, in fact, in Tversky's old classroom over this past year. And more, as I was passing the individual lines, I often thought Maimonides is not giving us the entire picture here. And this is obviously true in, let's say, Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah, when he gives out his the Rashi Prakim, the bare bones of his philosophical worldview. And even some of the halakhic stuff as well. You read and you think Maimonides is writing with one hand and concealing with the other. And I just wonder, in your travels within the world of Maimonidean thought. To what extent do you buy this as Maimonides as a concealer?
I think if you read Maimonides very closely for many, many years, you'll see certain shorthands that he uses for things that are not obvious to the casual reader, but which are significant. So let me give you one example, which is not in any way original to me. I think this is Professor Twersky's insight. Certainly he taught it to me. And that's a three-letter Hebrew word, miyad, which to any ordinary speaker of Hebrew means right away, instantly, or perhaps it means automatically. Now, Professor Twersky showed, I think pretty convincingly, that Maimonides very frequently uses the term miyad to describe how a process occurs naturalistically. That is to say, how an event can occur that you might think is caused in some way by God in an immediate sense, by God putting a thumb on the scales or intervening in the world. But actually, what Maimonides means is that God has created the world in such a way that when nature does its nature thing, when nature natures, this result will inevitably follow from this cause. Now, if you read the guide and you don't know that, it doesn't harm you, because you are getting the point, let's say, that God made something happen. And God did make it happen. God did not make it happen, according to Maimonides' true teaching, by reaching into the world and pushing it to happen, but rather naturalistically. But is Maimonides hiding that? The reason he's not hiding it is that Maimonides himself will tell us in the code, famously when he's talking about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, that God did not literally harden Pharaoh's heart. God created the human character in such a way, following Aristotle's principles of human psychic development and moral development, that if you acclimate yourself to bad practices, you dig yourself deeper into the rut, you turn yourself into that person. And so you have free will in having chosen it. But God also caused it because God created things in that structural way. And so he's not hiding that. He explains that to you. It so happens that if you read the code carefully and read Rambam carefully, you'll discover that concept deployed frequently. And sometimes there's this little shorthand for it, miyad. So I don't think of that as secretive, but I agree that not every time that it comes up does Maimonides go into a full detailed explanation, because it's not necessary or appropriate. Or one other example, in dealing with one of the hardest problems in the guide, namely the problem of what's called divine foreknowledge of the particulars, Maimonides does a certain thing. So what is that? What is the problem? The problem is this straightforward one, and I'm just going to paraphrase how Maimonides himself presents it in the code, not even in the guide, in the Mishnah Torah. It's a deep philosophical problem. If God knows everything in advance, and if God is all-powerful, then how can it be that anyone ever has any kind of free will to do anything? Because if God knows it's going to happen, then it has to happen, because God can't be wrong. So when I think I'm choosing something that hasn't yet happened, I must not really be freely choosing it. I could not have done other than as I did. And I will just say biographically, I remember encountering this problem when I was about 12 in 7th grade. And it came up in Talmud class somehow, not in a class where we were studying the Rambam, which was unfortunate. And just getting into a huge argument with my Talmud teacher. I mean, a huge argument about this, because he just told me it wasn't really a problem and I shouldn't worry about the problem. And I was like, but it's a logical problem. It has to be a problem. Now, the Rambam anticipated our dispute. And I wish that, we had both I didn't know about that because I was 12. And the Rambam says in the code, this is a big problem. And mountains of theological significance rest upon it, he says. But he says, I'm not going to solve it for you here. I'm just going to tell you that God's knowledge is not the same as your knowledge. And I'm going to tell you, stop there for now. Now, Maimonides is not hiding anything from you. He's telling you that he hasn't really answered it. But he's also telling you that you don't need to worry about it if you're the reader of this book. So in that sense, Maimonides is not telling you everything that you might want to know, but I don't think he's hiding it exactly in the code. I think he would be confident standing by any of these statements. And although he was certainly someone who believed that human beings had different capacities, I know, and of course he thought it was best to pursue your intellectual abilities as best as you possibly could. He's not blaming the person who can't quite get there. And I don't think he's tricking or lying to that person either, which is somewhat implied by the idea that he has a public teaching, a so-called exoteric teaching, and a secret teaching, an esoteric teaching.
So much so that my my ancestor, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Yavitz, was of the famous opinion that the Guide of the Perplexed was in fact a forgery, was written by someone else and only later and fraudulently ascribed to Maimonides, which hasn't received any acceptance pretty much either in the traditional or academic world. But it shows that that problem was a serious problem. In other words, if you think,
for sure, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was one of the great geniuses of early modern Jewish life, was interestingly someone who was really interested in the critical question of how do you read old Jewish sources and figure out whether they're authentic or not. And he famously had very skeptical views about the Zohar on this ground because he was living in an era where philological scholarship was starting to come into existence. People were asking questions like that. And this shows you, his view about the Guide shows you that he was thinking seriously about it. And for him, from internal evidence, he was a little worried about how the same person could have written these two books.
Yes, exactly. So just to sort of to round off that question is, am I correct in saying that your position is largely that some of the differences or some of the apparent either inconsistencies or stopping at odd places on the part of Maimonides can be chalked down to his pedagogical approach? Is there
some of it can, and then some of it can be chalked up or down, chalked somewhere to something. Depends which side of the pond you're from. Can be ascribed to another feature, and this is something that he himself talks about this time in the Guide, and that is the question of how far can our logical reason take us? And here, in one of my favorite passages in the Guide, Maimonides explains what was the mistake of Elisha ben Abuya, Acher, the early rabbi who, there are many different stories in the Talmud explaining both what he did and why he did it, and so the Talmud is not even sure about this, but the Talmudic tradition recorded that he had walked away in some dramatic fashion from his religious observance. Though he continued to teach Torah and be aware of Torah. So a fascinating, complex figure, one I've always been deeply interested in. And the Rambam, Maimonides, ascribes Elisha ben Abuya's error to the belief that if you cannot prove something by logical reason, that thing must not be true. So that is a very specific kind of a mistake. And it's a mistake that readers of Maimonides sometimes forget that Maimonides wanted us to focus on. It means that there are moments when Maimonides genuinely thinks that he cannot prove something that seems very important to religious tradition by logical reason. He can't prove it to be true. But he also can't definitively prove it not to be true. And on those questions, he's not saying that it's true. He's saying, you can't be sure it's true, and you can't be sure it's not true, so it could be true. That's my interpretation of what Maimonides is saying. That saves you if you feel committed to some traditionalist belief, because it could be true.
And that's sufficient grounds, in his opinion, for maintaining a belief in it.
That's a more complicated question, which he never quite says. He just says it would be a mistake, a disastrous mistake, to conclude that it must not be true. So one possible interpretation of Maimonides, and I'm not by any means presumptuous enough to claim this is the right interpretation, but one possible interpretation of Maimonides on some of these hardest questions that lie at the heart of why people are perplexed might be that he thinks that some of these questions you cannot answer ultimately with reason. It's beyond the capacity of human reason to prove or disprove. And if that's the case, you might still be able to go through life living your entire life as though you believe them, and maybe even believing them with a belief appropriate to something short of rational determination. And since Maimonides was committed to reason, that's not the same form of belief as it is to believe with rational proof. But if some of the hardest questions are like that, if some of the hardest questions like the eternity of the world are like that, then you might be able to see Maimonides as not so narrowly fitting into the position of traditional religious rabbinic believer or philosophical heretic hiding things, but rather someone who has a very complex view of what the capacities of the two different systems to prove things might turn out to be.
This is fascinating. I'm very happy you said this because for the following reason, which is that as Maimonides is often presented, and from certain passages does seem like he does seem to be someone who is very certain of his beliefs, who believes that the fundamental philosophical foundations of the religion are absolutely provable, and you can get there only if you do the philosophy absolutely correctly. Which, of course, is on the one hand brilliant, but on the other hand, distinctly compromises Maimonides' usefulness for the religious seeker today, right? Because I would say most philosophers today, and also most people who seek religious answers, either aren't impressed with the sort of medieval style thinking in general, the medieval logic, the sort of logical steps that would be taken in medieval philosophy, or doubt at all that firm conclusions can be reached in metaphysical matters, right? Ever since Immanuel Kant and really, from the 19th century philosophy onwards, many, I would say most intellectuals don't believe that certainty can be reached, or anything like certainty can be reached in these areas, which on the face of it would distinctly compromise the usefulness of Maimonides' writings. But if you are claiming, and if there can be grounds for
suggesting,
believing that,
I would say, claim is too strong right now. I'm suggesting a claim like this to be made would not. Much as I love podcasts, and like you, I had a podcast for a while. I think some philosophical claims aren't appropriate to make in a podcast, but to suggest them seems okay to me.
Okay, fine. The point that you're positing here, that on certain subjects Maimonides was cognizant that absolute certainty cannot be reached. So maybe that puts him much more in line with the sorts of assumptions that a contemporary seeker of religious answers might make.
Yeah, and I would say rational certainty cannot be reached, which is a little different than absolute. But you're right that reason, to the extent we're capable of understanding reason, should give us definitively right answers. And if some questions are not susceptible of that, that might leave space. And I think he's really worried. I mean, Maimonides says openly that he's worried about someone who, from the fact that things can't be proved rationally, concludes that they must not be true, and therefore walks away from religious practice because that's Elisha ben Abuya. And so, I mean, he's not hiding the ball there. He's telling you that that's a mistake. And so I think from the standpoint of a contemporary person who is seeking, who is perplexed, the Perplexed of Today, which was the title of the Guide for the Perplexed of Today was the title of a 19th century philosophical book that was trying to update Maimonides for different kind of philosophical, post-Kantian philosophical questions. But it's a title that keeps on giving, right? We can always keep on coming back to the philosophically perplexed of today. Yes, I think that might be a really useful insight to take away from Maimonides. And if I can just put in a brief plug for my own forthcoming book about Jewish thought, which has the unlikely and un-Maimonidean title, Bad Jew, A Perplexed Guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish People, which will be out in March. I talk about this passage in which Maimonides discusses Elisha ben Abuya. And although in that book I'm not trying to offer a comprehensive theory of Maimonides at all, I do have a hint in there that this kind of an approach could be very useful to someone today. I find it helpful for myself in my own moments of perplexity, which are many.
I see. Am I to read that book at face value, or is a Straussian reading?
The argument will be made very clearly in the first chapter that there is no such thing as a bad Jew. Yisrael af al pi shechata Yisrael hu.
Fair enough.
But Jews do walk around saying about themselves, often ruefully and sadly, "Oh, I'm such a bad Jew," and I want to encourage people not to have that feeling about themselves.
Despite having that as the title of your book.
Exactly.
I was going to say, interestingly, because Milton Steinberg wrote a very interesting fictionalized biography of Elisha ben Abuya called As a Driven Leaf. Yes. And that is exactly the point. It is based on this Maimonidean reading of it. Where do you fall on how useful Maimonides is to the contemporary a religious seeker? If someone does have religious questions, should they be turning to the guide? Is that a useful step, either at the beginning or the end of this journey?
It depends which questions you have. I mean,
I see.
Maimonides was writing for people who were really preoccupied with the question of the eternity of the world, the question of the nature of prophecy, free will versus determinism. Some of those questions remain live for seekers today, and anyone interested in those questions couldn't do better than to go there. But we have a whole new set of questions today that are different questions that have to do often for many people with the notion of equality, the question of inclusivity, whether it's okay to imagine a God who is in covenant with one group of people and not perhaps in the same way with other people. People who were worried about gender and equality, were worried about the capacity of the tradition to change and update itself in relationship to moral truths. there are points in Maimonides that are useful on those things, but those were not the preoccupations of his day. It would probably be a mistake to conclude the podcast, or at least for me, without at least mentioning that one of the things Maimonides did that was entirely original to him, I think really entirely original, in the guide, in the third part of the guide, is he tried to reconstruct the cultural world of the Bible using the closest thing to archaeological sources he had, which were books that had been preserved in Arabic that seemed like they were really old. They were actually pretty old, maybe not as old as he thought they were. And to then go back and read the Bible as an anthropologist or an archaeologist would, to try to figure out why certain practices were mandated. He was looking for reasons for the mitzvot, in that sense, reasons for the commandments, in the milieu in which he believed the Bible had been constructed by God, of course, for purposes of teaching certain eternal truths. So he thought that Maimonides believed, to put it bluntly, that in the Bible, God was teaching eternal truths to contingent human beings who needed to hear things in a certain way because they lived in a certain time and place. So that's an extraordinary thing for him to have done. It's relevant for people who are trying to reconcile themselves to why it would be that the Bible sounds like it embodies the morality and the values of a certain time and place. Maimonides accepted that, and he accepted that that morality could change, most famously on the question of sacrifices, where he thought that it was pretty obvious to him that as a matter of religious morality, sacrifices were not desirable, or they certainly were not necessary. But they are obviously central to the Bible's story of what the ancient Israelite religion should look like. And Maimonides explained that in the guide on the basis of God was speaking to people who lived in a specific cultural context. So for those for whom the problems they're troubled by have to do with that kind of change between the beliefs of the ancient period and the beliefs of today, again, Maimonides has some richness and some depth and is worth exploring in that way. But just as Maimonides himself believed that God was teaching eternal truths, similarly, we who go back to read Maimonides in this way will not find, we're not going to find every answer corresponding to exactly what today's moral values might be. So you're not going to get magic solutions there. But Jews with problems have looked to Maimonides in this way for many, many years, and many of them have reached very different conclusions on the basis of reading Maimonides. So, for example, in the 19th century, many Jewish reformers liked Maimonides' idea that God spoke to a specific cultural milieu, but rejected Maimonides' idea that we're stuck with the law nevertheless, and that we shouldn't be able to change the law on our own whims. So, people can take different things from Maimonides in different moments. So my short answer is it's very much worth reading. It will answer some kinds of questions. It will help you approach some other kinds of questions. And then there's a whole set of questions that Maimonides just wasn't focused on because they weren't the questions for the perplexed of his day.
Interesting. I'm very intrigued by your portrayal of Maimonides as sort of using the primitive anthropology of his day to reconstruct the Bible, because, of course, what it does open the door to do is to do this today with a much greater degree of accuracy. I mean, we know vastly more about the world of the ancient Near East today than was known in the 12th century. So I think that's all we have time for this evening. Professor Feldman, thank you so very much for joining us on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This was a lot of fun, and I look forward to future opportunities.
It was an honor for me. Thank you for having me, JJ, and I'm really looking forward to future conversations.
Excellent. Until next time. This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.